Before humans had writing, before they had cities, before they had names for the stars, they may have already carried a strange power inside them. The ability to make another mind see something that was not there. A sound in the dark could mean danger. A gesture near the fire could mean memory. A repeated call could hold the shape of a place, an animal, a child, or someone who had gone missing. But the cold truth is that the first spoken word left no fossil, no mark in stone, no trace we can point to and say, "Here, this is where language began." So when did human speech truly begin? When the mouth made a sound, or when another mind understood what it meant? To follow that question, we have to begin in a place where the evidence is almost silent. Not silent because early humans had no voices, and not silent because their lives were empty, but silent because speech itself disappears as soon as it is spoken. A stone tool can remain in the ground for hundreds of thousands of years. A bone can harden, break, be buried, and still give us a faint shape of the body that carried it. A footprint can survive in mud if the conditions are rare enough. But a word does not stay behind. It does not sink into the soil. It does not leave an edge, a scratch, or a colour on a cave wall unless someone later chooses to mark something down. The earliest speech, whatever form it took, vanished into air. It lived only for the short moment between one breath and another, between one person making a sound and another person understanding that sound. This is why the beginning of human speech is not like the beginning of farming, or the building of shelters, or the making of fire. Those things can sometimes leave traces. Speech asks us to study an absence. It asks us to look at bones, tools, social life, memory, hearing, breathing, childhood, cooperation, and the slow shaping of the human brain. Then admit that none of these things alone can give us the first word. The question, then, is not whether early humans made sounds. Many animals make sounds. Birds call, wolves howl, apes gesture and vocalize. Mothers across many species respond to the cries of their young. The deeper question is when sound became shared meaning in a human way. When did a call begin to carry not only fear, but direction? When did a repeated sound begin to stand for a place beyond the trees, or an animal that had passed there yesterday, or a danger that was not yet visible? When did one mind begin to place an image inside another mind? Not by showing it, not by touching it, but by shaping air with the mouth. We should move carefully here, because it would be easy to invent a scene that feels satisfying and call it history. It would be easy to imagine a single ancestor standing in the dawn, speaking the first word while the others suddenly understood. But the real story was almost certainly slower, less dramatic, and more difficult to separate from everything else humans were becoming. Speech may not have arrived like a door opening. It may have gathered slowly, through cries, gestures, rhythms, shared attention, memory, imitation, and the need to stay close in a world where being alone was dangerous. So the first step is not to search for a lost sentence. It is to enter the long silence around the evidence and listen for the conditions that could have made speech possible. The prehistoric world was not silent. It only becomes silent when we try to recover it from the ground. In life, it would have been full of sound. Wind moving through grass, water striking stone, insects in the dark, animals calling across open land, firewood breaking softly in the heat, children breathing in sleep, adults shifting near the edge of a shelter, and somewhere inside that living noise, human voices. Those voices may not yet have carried language in the full sense we know today. We should not imagine complete sentences too early, or picture ancient people speaking exactly as modern people do. But we should also not imagine them as wordless shadows moving through a mute world. Long before writing, long before any carved mark could preserve a thought, early humans and their relatives had to notice one another, respond to one another, and survive beside one another. A mother did not need a dictionary to hear distress in a child's cry. A group did not need grammar to turn their heads when someone gave a sharp warning sound. A hand lifted toward the distance, a body becoming still, a face tightening with alertness, could change the behavior of everyone nearby. This matters because the origin of speech did not begin with speech alone. It began in a wider field of attention, where sound, gesture, gaze, memory, and shared danger slowly work together. If we ask when humans first began to speak, we have to ask what kind of life made speaking useful. A creature living alone has fewer reasons to build a rich bridge between minds. A social creature, surrounded by children, elders, companions, rivals, injuries, hunger, weather, and the need to move at the right time, has many reasons. The earliest steps towards speech may have been hidden inside ordinary moments. Calling someone back from a slope, warning a child away from water, recognizing the cry of a familiar person, calming fear after a storm, or drawing attention to tracks that only one pair of eyes had noticed. None of these moments would fossilize. They would vanish immediately after they happened, yet they point toward the kind of pressure that could make communication more exact over many generations. A vague cry can warn. A more controlled sound can warn more clearly. A gesture can point. A sound joined with a gesture can hold attention longer. A repeated sound used in a similar situation can begin to feel expected. Slowly, the group does not merely react to noise. It begins to listen for meaning. Still, we have to remain careful. Meaning is not the same thing as language. Many animals use signals that carry information, and some can learn or respond to complex cues. What makes the human question so difficult is not whether early humans communicated, but when communication became flexible enough to speak about things beyond the immediate moment. A warning cry belongs to now. A remembered path belongs to yesterday and tomorrow. A sound for a nearby animal is one thing. A sound that helps others imagine an animal no one can see yet is something deeper. Somewhere between alarm, gesture, memory, and shared attention, the path towards speech becomes visible, but only faintly. It is not a road marked by dates. It is more like a track crossing dry ground, broken in places, easy to lose, but still leading toward the strange human ability to let one mind reach quietly into another. The closer we move toward the origin of speech, the more the question becomes less like looking for an object and more like watching a shadow form around many objects at once. There is no single bone that says, "This being spoke." There is no stone tool that can tell us what was said while it was being made. Even a painted mark on a cave wall, beautiful as it may be, cannot repeat the voice that may have once explained it, named it, or remembered the hand that placed it there. What remains are fragments of possibility. A skull may suggest something about brain size or the shape of the face. A jaw may hint at the movement of the mouth. A tiny bone in the throat may invite questions about sound. The inner ear may suggest what ranges of sound could be heard. Tools may show planning. Burials may suggest social feeling. Ornaments may suggest symbolic thought. But each piece is incomplete, and none of them alone can safely carry the full weight of language. This is why the story of human speech must begin with humility. We can say that modern humans speak with extraordinary flexibility. We can say that our close relatives, living and extinct, had forms of communication. We can say that language likely grew from older abilities rather than appearing from nothing. But we cannot honestly point to one morning, one valley, one ancestor, and say the first true sentence was spoken there. The evidence does not allow that kind of certainty. It asks for patience instead. It asks us to imagine a long period in which many things were changing together. Bodies becoming better at controlled breathing and fine sound. Brains becoming better at memory and social attention. Hands becoming better at gesture and tool-making. Groups becoming more dependent on shared knowledge. Children needing longer care. And elders carrying information that younger members could not yet know. In such a world, speech would not be a decoration added to life. It would be woven into survival, but slowly, unevenly, and probably in ways that did not yet resemble the full languages spoken today. A sound might be understood only inside one small group. A gesture might matter only in one repeated situation. A rhythm might help people move together. A call might attach itself to a place, a person, or a danger through use. not through any formal invention. Over time, small habits of shared meaning could become more stable. The difference between a cry and a word may not have been clear at first, even to those who used it. A cry bursts from the body. A word can be chosen. A cry belongs to feeling. A word can travel toward memory. A cry fades when danger passes. A word can return later, beside a fire, when the danger is gone but the lesson remains. Somewhere in that slow difference, the path toward human speech becomes easier to feel, though still impossible to date exactly. This careful uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the most truthful part of it. The beginning of speech is hidden because speech was alive, and living things often leave only traces of their conditions, not the full sound of their presence. So we begin not with an answer, but with a landscape of clues, bodies capable of sound, minds capable of sharing attention, groups that needed one another, and a world in which meaning may have begun long before anyone could have known that meaning was becoming language. The difficulty with speech is that it belongs to the most fragile kind of evidence, an event that happens, changes the people who hear it, and then disappears. A stone blade can fall from a hand and remain in the soil. Charcoal can survive after a fire has gone out. A bone can carry marks of cutting, healing, hunger, injury, or age. Even footprints, under rare conditions, can hold the shape of a passing body long after the person is gone. But a spoken sound does not remain in that way. It is made from breath. It moves through air. It enters the ears of others, changes attention, perhaps changes behavior, and then it is gone. If no one marks it, repeats it, or remembers it, it leaves no direct trace at all. This makes the origin of speech different from many other questions in human history. We can study the spread of tools because tools endure. We can study ancient diets through bones, teeth, residues, and the remains of plants or animals. We can study movement through stone sources, genetics, and the distribution of artifacts. But speech asks us to study something that may have shaped everything while preserving almost nothing of itself. This is why any honest story about the beginning of human speech must move slowly. It cannot begin with certainty. It cannot begin by pretending that we have found the first word. It has to begin with the things around speech, the bodies that could produce sound, the ears that could hear it, the brains that could remember it, the groups that needed it, and the repeated situations that may have made it useful. In a way, speech is visible only by the shadows it casts. If a group made complex tools, there may have been teaching. If there was teaching, there may have been gesture, demonstration, correction, and perhaps vocal signals. If a group cared for injured members, there may have been communication around need, pain, patience, and help. If people returned again and again to seasonal places, there may have been shared memory about routes, timing, and danger. If symbolic objects were made or carried, there may have been meanings that had to be recognized by others. None of these clues proves a spoken language by itself, but each one belongs to the wider world in which speech could grow. The danger is that our minds want the missing sound too badly. We want to hear an ancient person call across the dark. We want to know whether the first word meant food, danger, mother, fire, water, or something else entirely. But the evidence does not let us choose. Any exact first word would be an invention, not history. The truthful path is quieter. It asks us to let the silence remain where silence is real, and then to ask what kind of life could have made that silence meaningful. The first speech may have been so ordinary that no one noticed it as new. It may have been a small sound, repeated in a familiar situation, a sound that helped others look, wait, return, or remember. It may have been joined with a hand movement, a face, a direction of the eyes, a shared memory of danger or food. It may have belonged to a small group and meant nothing beyond that group. It may have changed slowly, disappearing in one generation, strengthening in another, becoming clearer only because children learned what adults used and then used it again. This is why the beginning of speech cannot be separated from repetition. A sound heard once can vanish, A sound heard many times can become expected. A sound expected by others can begin to carry meaning before anyone thinks of it as language. The first steps towards speech may not have needed names in the modern sense. They may have needed only stability, the same sound, or nearly the same sound, returning often enough for others to trust it. Trust is important here. A group had to trust that a warning sound meant something. A child had to trust that a soothing voice meant safety. A companion had to trust that a call from behind meant return, wait, or come closer. Without trust, sound remains uncertain. With trust, sound begins to become part of social life. It becomes a small agreement, not written down, not planned, not explained, but lived. This is one reason the fossil record feels so incomplete when we ask about speech. It can show us the stage, but not the voices on the stage. It can show us tools, shelters, pigments, bones, and traces of movement, but it cannot give us the breath that passed between people. Still, the absence of the voice does not make the voice unimportant. Sometimes the most powerful human changes are the least durable in material form. A word can stop a child from stepping into danger. A warning can change the path of a group. A remembered sound can bring people back to water. A repeated tone can make fear settle enough for sleep. None of these acts has to leave a mark on stone, yet each could matter more than many objects that survive. So the search for the beginning of speech is also a lesson in humility. It teaches us that not everything important becomes visible to archaeology in the same way. Some parts of the human past remain hidden not because they were small, but because they were made of living movement, breath, attention, memory, and response. When we ask when humans first began to speak, we are asking about one of those hidden movements. We are asking when breath began to carry meaning reliably enough that another mind could receive it. And because breath itself has vanished, we must follow the slower evidence around it, careful not to turn silence into certainty, but also careful not to mistake silence for emptiness. Before speech became words, it may have lived first as attention. One person saw something, and another person had to be brought into that seeing. In a prehistoric landscape, this could happen without a sentence. A hand could rise slowly toward the edge of the trees. A body could stop walking. A face could tighten. A quiet sound could pass from one throat to another, not yet a word in the way we use words now, but not meaningless either. It could tell the others that something had changed. It could pull the group's eyes toward the same place. This is one of the oldest routes we can imagine for human speech. Not because we have a fossil of the first gesture, but because speech depends on something deeper than sound. It depends on shared attention. To speak is not only to make noise, it is to guide another mind toward a thing, a feeling, a danger, a memory, or a possibility. Long before a person could say the name of an animal, they may have been able to show that an animal was near. Long before anyone could describe a path, they may have been able to make others look toward the direction of movement. Long before language could carry stories, signals may have carried urgency, comfort, warning, invitation, refusal, and recognition. This does not mean early humans already had full language. We have to stay careful here. Many animals communicate with calls, postures, facial expressions, and learned signals. Some animals warn others. Some recognize individuals. Some use gestures in social life. But the human path towards speech seems to have required these older abilities to become more flexible, more intentional, and more deeply tied to memory. A cry of fear can burst from the body. A signal meant for someone else is different. It asks to be received. It waits, in a way, for another mind to respond. In the quiet life of an early human group, such signals would have mattered every day. A child moving too close to a riverbank, a companion falling behind, a hidden animal shifting in grass, a patch of edible roots found after a long search, a storm building beyond the ridge. None of these moments needed a complete sentence at first, but each could reward clearer communication. A vague sound might make the group alert. A more familiar sound might make them look in a certain direction. A gesture joined with a sound might make them understand more quickly. Repetition could make the signal stronger. Over time, a sound used again and again in similar moments might begin to feel attached to that kind of moment. The group might not think of it as a word. They might not think of language at all. They would simply live inside habits of meaning. Someone calls, and others turn. Someone points, and others follow the line of the hand. Someone makes a soft, calming sound, and a frightened child settles. These small exchanges are easy to overlook because they are ordinary, but ordinary things can become powerful when they are repeated over thousands of generations. If we are asking when humans first began to speak, we should not begin by imagining a sudden first sentence. We should begin with the slow strengthening of signals between bodies that needed one another. Speech may have grown from this older field of gesture, voice, gaze, and response, until sound was no longer only a reaction to the world, but a way of carrying part of the world from one mind into another. A gesture can gather attention, but a voice can reach where the hand cannot. In the dark, in tall grass, behind stone, across a short distance where faces are hidden, sound has a different power. It can travel around the body. It can move through mist, through branches, through the edge of night. For early humans, this would have mattered deeply, because life did not always happen in clear daylight with everyone standing close together. A child could wander behind a rock. A companion could move ahead along a slope. Someone could find water just beyond a bend in the land. A warning might need to pass quickly before the group could see what caused it. In such moments, the voice became more than a release of feeling. It became a way to hold the group together when sight was not enough. This does not mean that the first voices were words. They may have been calls, tones, cries, repeated sounds, changes in rhythm, or small vocal patterns that carried meaning only because a group had heard them many times before. A sharp sound might bring stillness. A softer sound might call someone nearer. A repeated sound might help a child know where the adults were. A low sound might calm fear beside the fire. We cannot recover the exact sounds, and we should not invent a prehistoric vocabulary as if we know it. But we can understand why vocal signals would have become important in a social life, where distance, darkness, danger, and care were always present. The voice allowed meaning to move without touch. It allowed one person to affect another before they were seen. It allowed attention to travel faster than footsteps. This is one reason the question of speech begins long before speech becomes language. The human voice had to become useful first. It had to become something others listened to, not only as noise but as a sign that mattered. Among many animals, calls can warn, gather, soothe, or announce presence. Early human communication likely grew from older biological roots like these, but the human path seems to have moved toward greater control and flexibility. A cry that happens automatically is different from a sound shaped for another person. A gasp of fear may warn by accident. A deliberate call can be repeated, adjusted, softened, strengthened, or aimed at someone specific. That difference may have been one of the quiet beginnings of speech. Imagine, without making the scene too certain, a small group resting near a shelter as evening falls. The fire is low. The land is not empty. It is full of things that can be heard before they are seen. One person returns from the dark edge of the trees and gives a sound the others know. It does not explain everything. It does not tell a story, but it changes the group. Heads lift. A child is pulled closer. Someone reaches for a tool. Someone else listens toward the same direction. The sound has crossed from one body into many bodies. It has shaped behavior. It has made the unseen present for a moment. That is not yet the full miracle of human language, but it is close to the soil from which language could grow. Over long stretches of time, sounds that were useful may have become more controlled. Sounds tied to repeated situations may have become more recognizable. A call used near water, a call used for danger, a call used for returning, a call used for calming, a call used for gathering. Each one would still be simple, but simplicity does not make it unimportant. The origin of human speech may have passed through countless ordinary sounds like these, none preserved, none remembered, each lasting only a breath, yet each helping a group learn that the voice could do something remarkable. It could carry a small piece of the world to someone who was not yet looking at it. A signal becomes more powerful when it can return. A single cry may vanish with the danger that caused it, but a repeated sound begins to live inside a group. It becomes familiar. It begins to carry expectation. When the same kind of sound is heard in the same kind of moment, again and again, the listeners do not begin from nothing each time. They remember. They have heard this before. They have turned their heads before. They have seen what followed. This quiet connection between sound and memory may have been one of the deepest steps towards speech. Not a sudden invention, not a first word carved into time, but a slow binding of voice to experience. In the life of early humans, there would have been many repeated situations: leaving a shelter, returning to a shelter, finding food, losing sight of a child, seeing tracks in wet ground, hearing movement after dark, sharing meat, refusing danger, calming fear, calling someone by recognition, even if not yet by a name in the modern sense. Each repeated situation gave sound a chance to become more stable. A voice could begin to mean not only "I feel this, but you should know this." That movement, from expression to communication, sits close to the beginning of speech. It does not require us to imagine grammar too early. It does not require us to pretend that early humans had full sentences before the evidence allows it. It only asks us to notice that language could not have begun unless sounds became dependable enough for others to trust them. A group that lives together learns one another's voices. It learns who is afraid easily, who has seen something real, who is calling from nearby, who is calling from far away. It learns tones before it learns words. Even now, long after language has become complex, tone still carries meaning beneath speech. A voice can soothe before the words are understood. A voice can alarm before the sentence is complete. A voice can tell a child that the world is safe enough for sleep. This older layer of sound did not disappear when language grew. It remained underneath it. For that reason, the origin of speech may not be found only by asking when humans first named objects, but also by asking when human groups began to trust patterned sound as part of social life. A call used once is only a moment. A call remembered by others becomes part of the group's shared world. Over generations, such patterns could grow finer. A sound might become different depending on who was being called. A warning might change depending on whether danger was close or distant. A soothing sound might become softer for children than for adults. A gathering call might become stronger in open land than near a cave mouth. These small changes would not yet be the full structure of language, but they would make the voice more intentional, more flexible, and more attached to meaning. Slowly, sound could begin to point beyond itself. It could point toward a place, a person, a danger, a need, a memory, or an action. And once sound could point, even faintly, the path toward words became more imaginable. The first true speech may have grown out of this patient repetition. Voices heard, remembered, expected, and answered. No one needed to know that language was beginning. No one needed to step outside the moment and name it. They only needed to live together long enough for certain sounds to matter, and then to matter again. To speak, a body must do something very delicate. It must take breath, shape it, control it, release it, and turn moving air into sound that another person can hear and recognize. This may seem ordinary to us because speech happens so easily in daily life, but it is not simple. The mouth, tongue, lips, throat, lungs, ears, and brain all have to work together. A spoken sound is not just noise leaving the body. It is a small act of coordination. For the origin of human speech, this matters because even if an early human group had many reasons to communicate, the body still had to be capable of producing sounds with enough control and variety to make speech possible. We should be careful here, because bones do not record voices. A fossil skull cannot tell us exactly what a person sounded like. A jaw cannot preserve a word. A throat does not fossilize in the way stone does. Yet the body leaves hints. The shape of the face, the position of the vocal tract, the ability to control breathing, the hearing range suggested by parts of the ear, and small bones connected to speech can all help researchers ask what kinds of sounds ancient humans and their relatives may have been able to make. None of these clues gives a final answer by itself, but together they remind us that speech had a physical history. It was not only an idea, it had to pass through flesh. A person who speaks must hold back breath, divide it, soften it, sharpen it, and let it leave in patterns. This is different from a cry that bursts out suddenly. A cry can happen without much choice. Speech requires more control. It requires the body to pause, adjust, and shape sound on purpose. The tongue must move with precision. The lips must open and close in small changes. The jaw must shift. The breath must not simply escape all at once. Even the rhythm of speech depends on the body's ability to manage air slowly enough for sound to become patterned. In the long path toward human speech, this control may have grown gradually. Early vocal signals did not need to be complex at first. A call could be short. A tone could be rough. A sound could be useful even if it carried only a simple meaning. But as social life became more dependent on shared attention and memory, sounds that could be shaped more clearly would have become more useful. A clearer call can travel better. A more distinct sound can be remembered more easily. A controlled sound can be repeated with less confusion. This is where the body and the group meet. The body makes sound possible, but the group gives sound a reason to become precise. In a quiet shelter, a soft call might soothe a child. In open land, a stronger sound might gather companions. Near danger, a sudden sharp sound might freeze movement. Over time, the human body did not need to invent speech in one leap. It only had to give social life more and more control over the voice. The beginning of speech, then, was not only hidden in the mind, it was also hidden in breath, in the throat, in the tongue, and in the slow human ability to turn the body itself into a carrier of meaning. One of the quiet mysteries of speech is that it depends on parts of the body we usually do not notice. We notice the word after it has already formed, but before that word reaches the air, the body has done a careful sequence of small movements. Breath rises from the lungs. The throat narrows or opens. The vocal folds vibrate. The tongue changes shape. The lips round, close, or soften. The jaw gives space. The ears listen back, not only to others, but to the speaker's own voice. This hidden coordination is important, because the beginning of speech was not only a question of wanting to communicate. Many living creatures need to communicate. The harder question is how a body became able to make sounds that were controlled enough, varied enough, and repeatable enough to carry more than simple emotion. In humans, speech uses breath in a special way. We do not simply exhale and make noise. We slow the breath down. We divide it into phrases. We hold it back for a moment, then release it with fine control. This ability may sound small, but without it, words would be difficult to shape. A cry can rush out. A shout can break open suddenly. But speech needs patience inside the body. It needs the breath to become available for meaning. When we think about early humans, we cannot know exactly how their voices sounded. We cannot know what early calls, tones, or proto-words may have been like. The soft tissues of the throat are gone. The air that carried those sounds is gone. Still, researchers can look at related clues: the skull, the base of the cranium, the jaw, the teeth, the hyoid bone, the ear structures, and the overall anatomy of ancient humans and their relatives. These clues do not give a full recording of the past. They only narrow what might have been possible. That is why we must speak with care. It would be too simple to say that one fossil proves language. It would also be too simple to say that silence in the fossil record means silence in life. The truth is quieter. The body gives hints, and the hints suggest that the ability to speak was built from many small capacities working together. Hearing was part of this too. Speech is not complete when sound is made. It has to be heard clearly enough to be useful. If early humans were using increasingly fine vocal signals, then listening mattered as much as speaking. A group had to hear differences between calls, tones, and repeated sounds. They had to recognize familiar voices. They had to notice whether a sound came from nearby or far away, whether it carried fear or calm, whether it asked them to gather, wait, follow, or turn back. The path towards speech, then, was not only in the mouth of the speaker, it was also in the ears and attention of the listener. Over many generations, a body that could make slightly more controlled sounds, and a group that could hear and remember those sounds, would make communication more stable. This is why the physical history of speech cannot be separated from social life. A tongue becomes useful because someone is listening. A breath becomes meaningful because someone understands the pattern. A voice becomes more than a voice because it begins to live between people. So when we ask when humans first began to speak, we are also asking when the human body became a place where air, muscle, hearing, memory, and social need could meet. Speech did not float above the body like an abstract gift. It had weight, it had breath, it had effort. It came through living tissue, shaped by daily use, and it may have grown slowly in the space between what the body could produce and what the group needed to understand. Among the small clues left by ancient bodies, one of the most often mentioned is the hyoid bone, a delicate bone in the throat that helps support parts of the tongue and larynx. It is small, easily lost, and rare in the fossil record, so we should not give it more certainty than it can carry. Still, it reminds us that speech was tied to anatomy in quiet, practical ways. A voice does not come from the mouth alone. It rises through a passage shaped by the throat, the tongue, the lips, the jaw, and the spaces of the face. If those structures change, the possible sounds can change too. Some ancient human relatives may have had vocal abilities more complex than older assumptions allowed, and modern researchers are careful not to describe them as simply mute or animal-like. But the presence of a speech-related structure does not prove full language. A body may be capable of making many sounds without using them as modern language. This is the line we must walk throughout the question of when humans first began to speak. Possibility is not proof, and absence is not silence. The same care applies to the shape of the vocal tract. Humans can make a wide range of vowel and consonant sounds because the vocal tract can be finely shaped. The tongue can rise, flatten, curl, press, and release. The lips can close sharply, open gently, or round the breath. The throat can help create voice sound, rough sound, soft sound, loud sound. But speech is not only the power to make many sounds. It is the power to make sounds in ways that other people can recognize again. A sound that cannot be repeated clearly is hard to share. A sound that others cannot hear as distinct is hard to remember. So the evolution of speech required more than a flexible mouth. It required repeated social use. A group had to hear small differences and respond to them. Children had to learn the patterns used around them. Adults had to shape sounds in similar ways, often enough for those sounds to become familiar. In this sense, the body gave speech its instrument, but social life taught the instrument why it mattered. The beginning of speech may have rested in that meeting point. Not in one bone, not in one gene, not in one sudden change in the throat, but in the slow joining of breath control, hearing, mouth movement, memory, learning, and the need to be understood. It is tempting to ask whether there was a first fully human voice, a moment when the sound of our ancestors crossed some invisible line. But the evidence suggests a more gradual picture. The line between call, signal, and word may have been blurred for a long time. A sound could be partly emotional and partly intentional. A gesture could carry meaning while the voice added urgency. A repeated call could belong to a situation before it belonged to a clear word. The body did not need to produce modern speech all at once for the path towards speech to begin. It only needed to become a little more controlled, a little more expressive, a little more able to place sound into the shared life of the group. Over many generations, those small changes could become powerful. Breath became pattern. Pattern became recognition. Recognition became memory. Memory made sound return. And once sound could return with meaning, the human body was no longer only surviving in the world. It was beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to speak the world back to others. The body that speaks is also a body that listens to itself. This is easy to forget, because when we speak, we often think only of sending sound outward, but every voice also returns to the speaker. We hear our own tone. We feel vibration in the throat and chest. We notice, often without thinking, whether a sound came out too loudly, too softly, too sharply, or not clearly enough. This feedback may seem ordinary now, but it belongs to the deeper physical foundation of speech. A creature that makes sound can affect others, but a creature that can monitor, adjust, repeat, and refine sound has a different kind of possibility. Speech requires not only a voice, but a loop between making and hearing, between intention and correction. If a sound is meant to carry meaning, it must be shaped in a way others can recognize. If it fails, it must be tried again, softened, strengthened, shortened, or made more distinct. In modern humans, this process happens so quickly that it feels natural. We do not usually notice the breath being measured, the tongue moving, the lips narrowing, the ear checking the result, and the brain adjusting the next sound. Yet this hidden loop may have been one of the slow bridges between raw vocalization and speech. Early humans did not need to begin with perfect words. They only needed the capacity, increasing over time, to make certain sounds more deliberately and to notice whether those sounds worked. A call that brings others closer can be repeated. A call that causes confusion may be changed. A sound that children imitate easily may survive. A sound that is too difficult, too unclear, or too easy to confuse with another sound may disappear. In this way, the body and the group may have shaped one another. The body produced sounds, the group responded, the speaker learned, even without conscious theory, which sounds carried better. This kind of shaping does not require anyone to invent language in a single act. It can happen through use, through childhood, through imitation, through many small corrections repeated across generations. Children are especially important here, because the human path towards speech is also a path of learning. A newborn does not arrive speaking. A child listens before speaking clearly. A child hears voices, tones, repeated sounds, emotional patterns, and familiar rhythms long before understanding everything those sounds mean. This may have been true in ancient groups as well, even if their communication was far simpler than modern language. Children would have been surrounded by the sounds of their group, calls of warning, sounds of comfort, vocal patterns tied to food, movement, return, refusal, approval, fear, and play. They would hear the same voices again and again. They would learn not only from formal teaching but from atmosphere. A calm voice near warmth, a sharp sound near danger, a repeated call when someone returned, a soft tone when an adult wanted silence. Over time, the young body learns how the group sounds, and the young mind learns that sound belongs to meaning. This matters because speech is not passed on only through anatomy. A child may inherit a body capable of speech, but the actual patterns of speech must be learned socially. The tongue must learn the sounds of the group. The ear must learn what differences matter. The breath must learn the rhythm of communication around familiar people. Even before full language, this social learning would have been essential. A useful sound survives only if others learn it. If children do not carry it forward, it vanishes. The origin of speech, then, was not only in adult bodies coordinating survival, it was also in the slow listening of children, in the way young minds absorbed repeated sounds and made them part of the next generation. This gives the physical story of speech a softer but very important layer. The mouth and throat made speech possible, but childhood made it continuous, hearing made it adjustable, imitation made it shareable, memory made it stable. Without these loops, sound would remain scattered. With them, sound could become tradition. Not tradition in the sense of written rules, but living tradition. Patterns of voice that return because people use them, children learn them, and groups trust them. The ear also matters in another way. Speech depends on difference. One sound must be different enough from another to be useful. A warning sound must not be mistaken for a soothing call. A call to gather must not be confused with a sound of refusal. If early vocal communication became more complex, then listeners had to become sensitive to small contrasts. High or low, sharp or soft, repeated or single, near or distant, familiar or strange. The body that speaks, therefore, is never alone. Its voice is shaped by the listening bodies around it. A sound becomes meaningful only when the group can hear it as meaningful. The throat may produce it, but the community receives it, remembers it, and gives it value. That is why the physical origin of speech cannot be reduced to one anatomical feature. It is not enough to ask whether the tongue could move, whether the hyoid bone was shaped in a certain way, or whether the vocal tract allowed a range of sounds. Those questions matter, but they are only part of the whole. We also have to ask whether sound could be learned, repeated, corrected, heard, and trusted. We have to ask whether children could grow into the sound world of their group. We have to ask whether voices could become stable across time. Speech, in this deeper sense, was not just air-shaped by the mouth. It was air-shaped by a social body. Many people hearing, answering, imitating, and carrying sounds forward. Perhaps this is why the first human speech is so difficult to locate. It did not belong entirely to one person. It belonged to the space between people. It began wherever a sound was made, heard, adjusted, remembered, and used again. A voice can make sound, but speech begins to become human only when the mind can hold meaning behind the sound. This is why the body alone cannot explain when humans first began to speak. A throat may be able to produce many tones. A tongue may be able to shape breath with precision. Ears may be able to hear small differences. But none of that becomes speech unless the mind can connect a sound to something beyond the sound itself. Somewhere in the long human past, the voice had to become tied to memory, attention, intention, and shared understanding. A sound had to become more than a reaction. It had to become a sign. This step is difficult to see in the evidence because thoughts do not fossilize any more than words do. We cannot dig up the first meaning. We cannot hold in our hands the moment when one person made a sound and another person understood not only the noise, but the thing behind it. Yet this hidden step may be the center of the whole question. When did humans first begin to speak? Perhaps the deeper question is, when did humans first begin to use sound to carry something from inside one mind into another? To do that, the mind needed memory. A group could not build speech if every sound vanished completely after it was heard. A useful sound had to return. It had to be recognized. It had to remind listeners of something they had experienced before. If a certain call had been heard near danger many times, the next time it appeared, the body could respond before the danger was seen. If a soft sound had often meant safety, a child might calm when hearing it again. If a repeated vocal pattern belonged to gathering, returning, or waiting, then the sound was no longer only sound. It had become part of the group's remembered world. This kind of memory is small, but it is powerful. It is one of the quiet bridges between animal communication and human language. We must be careful, because many animals remember signals, respond to calls, and recognize social cues. Human speech did not come from a world with no communication, but human minds seem to have carried this ability much farther. A spoken sound could eventually point not only to what was happening now, but to what had happened before, what might happen later, and what others could not yet see. That is a much deeper kind of meaning. It requires the mind to hold an image when the image is absent, a place beyond the hill, a person who has not returned, a herd that passed yesterday, a dangerous crossing remembered from a previous season, a child who must be warned before the danger appears. This is where speech begins to stretch beyond simple alarm. It becomes a way to share invisible things, not invisible because they are magical, but because they are not present in front of the eyes. Memory makes them present again. The mind holds them, and the voice begins to carry them outward. In the slow history of human speech, this may have been one of the most important changes. The growing ability to let sound stand for something that was not immediately there. A cry belongs to the moment. A sign can reach beyond the moment. A word, when it finally becomes a word, can bring yesterday into the present or prepare the group for tomorrow. The first humans who moved towards speech may not have known they were doing anything extraordinary. They may have been calling, pointing, remembering, warning, soothing, and repeating. But inside those ordinary acts, the mind was learning a new power, to make sound hold meaning long enough for another person to receive it. For a sound to become meaningful, the mind must do more than remember it. It must also understand that another person can know something, miss something, fear something, want something, or need to be guided towards something. This is one of the quiet foundations beneath speech. Human language does not only name objects, it moves between minds. When someone speaks, even in the simplest way, there is usually an expectation that another person can receive the signal and change what they do, what they notice, or what they understand. In the long path towards speech, this ability may have grown from everyday social life. Early humans lived close to one another. They watched faces, they followed eyes, they learned who was calm, who was afraid, who had found food, who had been injured, who was calling from a distance, and who needed help. A sound in such a world was never just an isolated event. It belonged to a person. It came from a body with an intention, a fear, a memory, or a need. The listener had to ask, in a simple and perhaps wordless way, what does this mean for us? That question sits near the beginning of speech. A warning call is useful because others understand that the caller has noticed something they have not yet noticed. A pointing gesture is useful because others understand that the hand is not only moving, but directing attention. A repeated sound becomes useful because others learn that the speaker is not merely making noise, but trying to bring them into a shared situation. This is why speech could not grow from sound alone. It needed social understanding. It needed minds that were sensitive to other minds. We should be careful not to make this sound too modern or too complete. Early humans did not need to think in philosophical terms about intention or communication. They did not need to explain to themselves what meaning was. They only needed to live in groups where paying attention to others mattered. A child who learned the tone of an adult's voice was already learning that sound could carry care or warning. A hunter who followed a companion's gaze was already learning that another person's attention could reveal something hidden. An elder who repeated a sound or gesture in a familiar situation was helping younger members connect voice, memory, and action. Slowly, these shared patterns could make the mind more prepared for speech. The voice could begin to reach beyond immediate emotion because listeners were ready to treat it as directed toward them. A sound could say, not in full words yet, but in social meaning, "You should look, you should come, you should wait, you should remember." This is one reason the origin of speech is so difficult to separate from the origin of human cooperation. Words are not only labels placed on the world, they are tools for living together. They help a group divide attention, share danger, pass on knowledge, and hold fragile bonds across time. A person alone can make sounds, but speech needs someone on the other side. It needs a listener who can understand that the sound is meant to be understood. Somewhere in the long human past, this circle between speaker and listener may have grown tighter and more reliable. The speaker shaped sound more intentionally. The listener heard it less as random noise and more as a sign. The group remembered which signs mattered. Children grew into those habits and made them their own. No one needed to declare that speech had begun. The change could have happened quietly, in thousands of small exchanges, until the voice became a trusted path between one inner life and another. The mind that moves towards speech must be able to hold more than the present moment. It must be able to keep an image after the eyes no longer see it, to remember a place after the feet have left it, to feel the weight of a danger before the danger returns. This ability is ordinary to us now, but in the long history of human speech, it may have been one of the quiet foundations that made language possible. A voice can warn about what is happening now, but speech becomes deeper when it begins to carry what is absent. A track in mud is present. The animal that made it may already be gone. A child beside the fire is present. The riverbank where that child might fall is somewhere else. A storm is present when it breaks overhead, but the memory of last season's flood can exist long after the water has gone down. To speak in a human way is to let these absent things enter the shared life of the group. It is to make another person aware of something that does not stand directly before them. This does not mean early humans suddenly began telling long stories in complete sentences. That would be too simple and too certain. The movement may have begun with smaller acts of reference. A sound tied to a place, a gesture, tied to a direction, a repeated call tied to a kind of animal, a tone that reminded others of a danger they had met before. Slowly, the mind could learn that sound was not only a response to the visible world. Sound could point toward memory. It could point toward expectation. It could prepare the group for something not yet seen. This is where the origin of speech comes close to the origin of imagination, but not imagination in the sense of fantasy. It is the practical imagination of survival, picturing the bend in the river before reaching it, remembering which plants made someone sick, anticipating where animals might move when the weather changed, understanding that a person who is not in sight may still return, or may be lost. These are not abstract ideas floating far above daily life. They are the daily life of a social, vulnerable species learning to depend on shared knowledge. A single mind can remember, but a speaking group can distribute memory. One person's experience can become useful to someone who was not there. A warning from yesterday can shape movement tomorrow. A place can be carried in the voice before the body arrives there. This may be one of the reasons speech became so powerful. It allowed humans not only to react to the world, but to prepare for it together. The brain did not need to become modern in one sudden leap for this to begin. Small increases in memory, attention, imitation, vocal control, and social learning could have worked together for a very long time. Children would hear the same sounds in the same situations. Adults would repeat what had worked before. Groups would keep useful patterns and lose confusing ones. Meaning would become more stable, not because anyone designed a language, but because life rewarded signals that could be remembered and shared. The first path towards speech may have passed through this slow weaving of present and absent things. A sound in the mouth, a memory in the mind, a listener nearby, a need that mattered to the group. When those pieces met often enough, the voice could begin to do something remarkable. It could bring the unseen closer. It could make the past useful. It could let tomorrow enter the circle before it arrived. Fire changed the shape of human life, but not only because it gave warmth or light. Around fire, people could remain near one another after daylight faded. They could sit close in a circle where faces were partly visible, where hands were free, where children could rest, where older members could watch the group without walking, and where the night outside the shelter felt a little farther away. In such a place, communication did not have to be sharp or urgent all the time. It could become slower. A voice did not always need to warn or call across distance. It could soften. It could repeat. It could guide attention gently from one person to another. This matters for the question of when humans first began to speak, because speech may not have grown only from danger, hunting, or quick survival. It may also have grown from the quieter need to stay together. A group that shares warmth must also share space. A group that shares food must also manage waiting, giving, taking, refusing, comforting, and remembering. A child has to learn who is safe to approach. An injured person has to be cared for. Someone who found food earlier in the day may need to show through sound and gesture where it was found. Someone who saw danger may need to make others remember it after the danger has passed. These are not dramatic moments. but they are the kind of repeated social moments where communication can deepen. Firelight may have given those moments more time. During the day, hands were busy with walking, gathering, carrying, scraping hides, shaping stone, watching the land. At night, when the group settled, the voice could become more important. It could move in the space between people while bodies rested. A low sound could calm a restless child. A familiar tone could signal that food was being shared. A repeated pattern of voice could draw attention to a gesture, a tool, a wound, or a memory. We should not imagine this as modern conversation too early. We should not picture complete stories in a language we can understand, but we can see how a shelter or fire circle could reward more stable communication. When people stay together long enough, signals have more chances to be repeated. When signals are repeated, children can learn them. When children learn them, the signals can live beyond a single moment. The origin of speech may have depended on exactly this kind of repeated closeness. Not one bright invention, but many evenings in which sound was useful because others were near enough to hear it, remember it, and answer it. Around fire, a group could practice being a group. The voice could become part of that practice. It could help organize small acts of care, small acts of sharing, small acts of teaching. It could hold attention without needing force. It could let an elder repeat something slowly enough for a child to imitate. It could let a parent soothe without touching. It could let companions recognize one another in half-darkness. In this way, the path towards speech may have passed through the ordinary warmth of human nearness. Before words could carry large ideas, voices may have carried reassurance, warning, patience, and belonging. Before language became a way to describe the world, it may have helped people remain inside a fragile circle of safety, listening to one another while the dark gathered beyond the fire. A shared shelter does more than protect bodies from wind and rain. It creates a small world of repeated needs. Someone must keep the fire alive. Someone must move carefully around sleeping children. Someone must divide food without breaking trust. Someone must notice when an elder is cold, when a wound is worsening, when a child is frightened by thunder, when a companion has not returned. In that close space, communication becomes less like a sudden alarm and more like a steady thread running through daily life. This is important for the origin of speech, because language did not need to begin as something grand. It may have grown from simple, repeated acts of care and coordination. A soft sound could mean wait. A familiar tone could mean come closer. A repeated call could help a child recognize where the group was in darkness. A sound joined with a gesture could show how to scrape a hide, break a bone, tend embers, or avoid touching something hot. None of this requires us to claim that early humans already had full modern language. It only shows why a group living together would benefit from clearer and more reliable signals. The closer people live, the more often they must adjust to one another. They must avoid stepping on a sleeping body. They must know when to move quietly. They must sense when fear is spreading. They must calm conflict before it grows. A voice can do this in ways that hands cannot always do. It can cross the shelter without disturbing everyone. It can reach a child before the child understands a full instruction. It can mark approval, refusal, warning, comfort, and recognition. In a world without writing, without clocks, without stored records, these small vocal patterns would be part of how a group stayed coherent. Speech, when it finally became speech, did not float above these needs. It came through them. It came through the child who learned by hearing the same sound with the same action. It came through the adult who repeated a vocal pattern because others responded to it. It came through the elder who had lived long enough to know what should be remembered, but still needed a way to place that memory inside younger minds. Around shelter and fire, the voice had time to become familiar. Familiarity matters because meaning depends on recognition. A sound cannot become useful if no one remembers it. A gesture cannot teach if no one connects it with the action that follows. The repeated life of a group gives signals their weight. Day after day, the same people hear one another. They learn the difference between a playful call, a tired call, an urgent call, a warning call, a soothing call. They learn not only the sound, but the person behind it. This social closeness may have helped shape the path towards speech as much as danger did. Fear can make a cry important for a moment, but care can make a voice important every day. A group that cares for children has to repeat. A group that cares for the injured has to coordinate gently. A group that shares food has to manage desire, patience, fairness, and memory. These are quiet pressures, but they are strong. They reward sounds that others can understand without confusion. They reward tones that reduce fear. They reward repeated patterns that children can learn. Slowly, the voice becomes part of the shelter itself, as ordinary as ash, hide, stone, and breath. It helps people know who is near, what is needed, what should be avoided, and what can be trusted. If we ask when humans first began to speak, we may need to listen not only for the loud call across the open land, but also for the low voice beside the fire, the voice that did not announce a discovery, but helped a small group remain together through another night. Food is one of the oldest reasons for a group to communicate, but not only because people needed to find it. They also needed to share it, protect it, prepare it, remember where it came from, and teach others what could be eaten safely. Around fire and shelter, food became more than survival in the body. It became part of social life. A piece of meat passed from one hand to another could carry trust. A child watching an adult break open a bone could learn without needing many words. A warning sound near a bitter plant could prevent sickness. A repeated gesture over a root, a seed, a shell, or a strip of hide could help younger members connect an object with an action. This is another reason the origin of speech may have grown slowly from ordinary life. A group did not need a complete language in order to benefit from clearer signals during eating, preparing, and sharing. But the more often these moments happened, the more useful stable sounds would become. If a sound helped someone wait, it mattered. If a tone helped calm tension during sharing, it mattered. If a repeated call brought others when food was found, it mattered. If a vocal pattern helped teach what was safe or unsafe, it mattered deeply, because one mistake could bring illness, hunger, or danger to the whole group. We should not imagine early people sitting around a fire giving long lessons in modern speech. That would be too certain. Yet we can imagine, carefully, that teaching did not require writing, and that learning often happened through attention, imitation, gesture, tone, and repeated sound. A child hears a sound when an adult points to the wrong plant. The child sees a face of refusal. The child is pulled back gently. Later, the same sound returns, and the child remembers. In that small connection, the voice has become tied to knowledge. It has carried experience from one person to another. This may be one of the quiet beginnings of human speech, not a dramatic first word, but a remembered sound that helps someone avoid harm. Fire may have made this even more important because cooking and preparation created new shared routines. Food had to be placed near heat, turned, broken, scraped, divided, cooled, guarded, or saved. These actions could be shown by hand, but sound could guide them while the hands were busy. A low correction, a repeated rhythm, a call to wait, a sound of approval when a child copied correctly, all of these would help make learning smoother. The voice would not replace gesture. It would join gesture. Together, they could form a stronger bridge between minds. Over time, such bridges could become more reliable, and reliable signals are the ground from which words may grow. This keeps us close to the central question: when did humans first begin to speak? Perhaps the answer cannot begin with a single spoken name. It may have to begin with these repeated moments of shared need, when sound became useful enough to be remembered, trusted, and passed on. Around a fire, speech could become less urgent and more patient. It could help people not only survive danger, but inherit knowledge. It could allow one person's experience with food, weather, injury, or movement to become part of another person's future. In a world without writing, the voice was not decoration. It was a living tool of memory. It helped a group hold together through hunger, darkness, childhood, illness, and change. Before language could become story, law, ritual, or history, it may have first become a quiet aid to daily survival, repeated so often that no one noticed the moment when useful sound began to lean toward words. One of the quiet reasons speech may have deepened around fire and shelter is that human children take a long time to grow. A young child cannot survive only by instinct. It has to be carried, watched, corrected, fed, comforted, protected, and slowly taught how the world works. This long childhood may have given the human voice a special place in daily life. Before a child can understand a full instruction, it can still hear tone. Before it can speak clearly, it can still recognize familiar voices. Before it can remember a route, a season, or a dangerous plant, it can still learn that one sound means safety and another sound means stop. In a shelter, near warmth, surrounded by adults and older children, the young mind would be listening long before it could explain what it heard. This matters for the origin of speech, because language does not survive only by being useful to adults. It survives by being learnable to children. A sound pattern that cannot be learned by the young will not last beyond one generation. A signal that children hear many times, in similar moments, becomes part of their inner world. The voice of a parent, an older sibling, an elder, or a familiar companion can become attached to food, sleep, danger, patience, return, and belonging. We should not imagine prehistoric childhood as quiet or simple. It would have been full of watching and listening. A child would watch hands scraping hide, breaking bone, shaping stone, sorting plants, tending embers, carrying water, sharing food, and moving carefully near tools or fire. Beside those actions, the child would hear sounds. Some might be soft and repeated, some might be sharp and immediate, some might be playful, some might be corrective, some might not be words in the modern sense, but they would still carry social meaning. A sound could stop a child's hand before it touched something hot. A familiar tone could draw a child back from the edge of a shelter. A repeated call could help a child find the group in half darkness. A soothing voice could help the body settle into sleep, even when the night outside was full of unknown movement. These moments are small, but they are exactly the kind of moments where speech-like communication can become deeply rooted. They happen often. They matter. They involve repetition, emotion, trust, and learning. A child does not learn only from crisis. A child learns from thousands of ordinary signals that return again and again. This may have made the fire circle and the shelter more than places of rest. They may have been places where the sound world of the group was passed forward. The young listened to the old repeated what the young needed to know. Adults corrected each other, reassured each other, called each other, and responded to familiar voices. All of this created a living environment where sound was not random. Sound had patterns. It had social weight. It had memory. If speech emerged slowly, then childhood may have been one of its strongest pathways. Children are natural imitators. They copy sounds before they understand everything those sounds do. They repeat tones, rhythms, and vocal patterns because they belong to the people around them. In this way, the voice of the group enters the next generation not as a formal invention, but as daily atmosphere. A child hears a warning sound many times and later uses something like it. A child hears a calming sound and later gives it to a younger child. A child hears a call used when someone returns and slowly learns that voices can mark presence, distance, and recognition. These are not yet full explanations of language, but they show how speech could become continuous across time. The body gives children the capacity to vocalize. The group gives them the pattern. Repetition gives the pattern stability. Care gives the pattern emotional force. This connection between care and speech is important because it keeps us from imagining language as only a tool for hunting or danger. Human beings did not speak only because they needed to chase animals or warn of predators. They also needed to comfort the young, coordinate care, soothe fear, teach patience, and hold a group together through long nights. A voice can do something a hand cannot always do. It can reach a child from across the shelter. It can remain gentle when touch is not possible. It can guide without pulling. It can warn without striking. It can make the dark feel slightly less empty because someone known is nearby. This is not sentimental, it is practical. A calm child is safer. A warned child is safer. A child who learns the group's signals is more likely to survive. A group that can teach children without every lesson becoming an injury is stronger. Over generations, the repeated use of voice in care may have helped make vocal communication more flexible, more patient, and more finely tuned to emotion. Speech had to carry information, but it also had to carry relationship. A warning from a stranger may not be heard the same way as a warning from a trusted adult. A soothing sound works because the listener knows the voice. A teaching sound matters because the child recognizes attention behind it. This means that the roots of speech may have grown inside bonds as much as inside survival tasks. Around fire in the slow rhythm of night, human voices may have become attached to the deepest experiences of early life. Hunger being answered, fear being calmed, warmth being shared, danger being named or signaled, memory being repeated, and belonging being felt before it was understood. When we ask when humans first began to speak, we may be asking when these ordinary sounds of care began to become stable enough to teach, to comfort, and to last. Perhaps speech did not begin only with a call across open land. Perhaps it also began with a low voice near a sleeping child, repeated so often that meaning entered the body before the child ever knew what meaning was. To survive in open land, forest edge, river valley, or cold steppe, early humans had to do more than notice the world. They had to coordinate inside it. A single person could see tracks, hear movement, smell smoke, find berries, or remember a path. But a group needed a way to move together without breaking apart. This is where the path towards speech becomes tied to hunting, gathering, and daily survival. Not in a loud or heroic way, not as a sudden command shouted across a dramatic scene, but as a slow improvement in how people shared attention while moving through a dangerous and changing landscape. When a group left a shelter, they carried more than tools and hunger. They carried children, memory, caution, expectation, and the need to remain close enough to help one another. A gesture could work when people were near. A glance could guide someone standing beside you. But movement makes communication harder. Bodies spread out. Grass hides legs. Trees block sight. Wind covers small sounds. Children fall behind. Someone notices a track while another is looking elsewhere. Someone remembers water in one direction while the rest of the group is drifting another way. In these moments, a useful voice could become important. A short sound could gather attention. A repeated call could keep the group from scattering. A familiar tone could mean slow down, come back, wait, follow, or look there. We cannot know the exact sounds, and we should not pretend that we do, but we can understand why more controlled vocal signals would have had value. Survival did not only reward strong bodies, it rewarded shared timing. A group that moved too quickly might leave someone behind. A group that moved too noisily might frighten animals away or miss danger. A group that failed to warn children could lose them. A group that could not share the memory of water, fruiting plants, animal paths, or dangerous ground would have to learn the same lessons again and again at great cost. Speech, or the long preparation for speech, belongs in this practical world. It did not need to begin as a way to explain deep ideas. It may have first helped people move, wait, return, gather, and avoid harm. A track on the ground could tell one person that an animal had passed, but for that knowledge to help the group, it had to be shared. A hand pointing downward could bring another person close. A sound could call those farther away. A repeated vocal pattern could tell others that something important had been found before they saw it themselves. The sound did not have to be a modern word for animal or track. It only had to carry enough meaning to change behavior. This is the careful place where speech begins to feel possible without being fully visible. A signal tied to movement, a voice tied to direction, a memory tied to a route, a group learning, over time, that some sounds helped them survive because those sounds made private observations public. The origin of human speech may have depended on this simple need. One person saw something, but many people needed to act on it. In that need, the voice gained purpose. It became a way to stretch awareness beyond one pair of eyes and to let a group move through the world as if it had a shared mind. Gathering food may seem quieter than hunting, but it may have asked even more from memory and communication. A moving animal leaves tracks for a short time, but plants, roots, nuts, berries, shellfish, honey, water, and useful stones belong to places that must be remembered, revisited, and taught. A group that survived by gathering did not simply wander and take whatever appeared. It had to know seasons, soils, slopes, river edges, animal behavior, weather signs, and the difference between what nourished the body and what could harm it. This kind of knowledge is too large for one person to hold forever. It has to move between minds. Before writing existed, before any map could be scratched onto a surface and preserved, the living map was carried in memory, gesture, attention, and voice. A person who remembered a patch of edible roots beyond a ridge could not hand that memory to others like a stone tool. It had to be shown, repeated, walked, pointed toward, sounded out in some useful way. This is why the origin of speech may be deeply connected not only to danger, but to return. Return to the place where water remains after dry weather. Return to the tree that fruits at a certain time. Return to the shell beds exposed when the tide is low. Return to the slope where a certain plant grows after rain. A sound that helps guide people back to a place has already begun to carry more than immediate feeling. It carries remembered space. It carries experience. It carries the beginning of instruction. We should not imagine early humans naming every plant in a modern botanical sense. That would be too specific and too modern, but they did not need formal names for communication to become richer. A repeated sound near a plant, a rejecting tone when a child reached for the wrong berry, a call used when water was found, a gesture and vocal rhythm tied to digging, breaking, scraping, or weighting, these could all help knowledge become shared. The voice could mark difference. This one, not that one. Here, not there. Now, not yet. Come closer. Do not touch. Watch this. Follow me. Even if these were not full sentences, they show why speech would become useful in a foraging life. Gathering requires fine distinctions. The world is not divided only into safe and dangerous. It is full of almost safe, safe only after preparation, safe only in one season, useful only for tools, useful only when dried, bitter but edible, bright but poisonous, hidden but nourishing. The more a group depended on such distinctions, the more useful controlled communication became. A vague cry could not teach all of this. Gesture could show much, but gesture alone was limited when hands were full, when eyes were turned away, when a child needed correction quickly, or when memory had to be brought back before the object was present. The voice could travel with the body. It could accompany the hand. It could repeat while the action was being learned. Over generations, children growing inside such a world would absorb not only what to eat, but how the group sounded around food, danger, refusal, approval, return, and discovery. They would learn that certain vocal patterns belonged to certain kinds of attention. Slowly, sound could become part of knowledge itself. When we ask when humans first began to speak, we are also asking when survival knowledge became shareable through the voice in stable ways. The answer is hidden, but the need is clear. A group that could pass on gathered knowledge did not start from emptiness every generation. It could carry the land forward in memory, and perhaps, long before language became story, It was already helping people remember where life could be found. Hunting is often imagined as the loudest part of prehistoric life, but for speech it may have depended just as much on quietness. A group following animals could not always call openly without consequence. Too much noise could scatter prey, reveal position, or create confusion. This means that communication during hunting may have required a careful balance between sound, gesture, stillness, timing, and shared expectation. A lifted hand, a glance, a change in posture, a soft click of the tongue, a low call, a repeated signal known only inside the group. Any of these could help people move together without breaking the moment. Again, we cannot know the exact signals used by early humans, and we should not invent them as if they were preserved, but we can see the kind of problem that would have made more precise communication useful. Hunting is not only about force, it is about coordination. One person may see the animal first, another may know the shape of the land, someone else may understand where the animal is likely to run, a younger member may need to stay back, a child must be kept silent, a companion must know when to wait, when to move, when to circle, when to stop. In a world without spoken planning, these tasks become harder. In a world with even simple shared signals, they become more possible. The origin of speech may have been shaped by such moments, not because hunting created language by itself, but because it rewarded groups that could make private knowledge become shared action. A track on the ground is silent. The animal that made it may be gone. But the person who reads the track carries a kind of invisible information. They know, or suspect, something that others do not yet know. To help the group, that information must move outward. A finger points, a face tightens, a sound brings others closer, a gesture marks direction, a low voice may connect what is seen on the ground with what the group should do next. These are small acts, but they are close to the roots of speech because they join observation, memory, intention, and cooperation. They turn the mind of one person into a resource for many. Over long periods of time, groups that could coordinate more clearly would have had an advantage, not in every moment, not perfectly, but often enough for communication to matter. A signal that prevents a mistake matters. A sound that gathers people before an opportunity disappears matters. A remembered call that keeps a group from moving too soon matters. Speech, in its earliest path, may have grown from many such pressures working together. Hunting, gathering, caring for children, moving through changing seasons, returning to known places, avoiding danger, and teaching what could not be learned alone. It is important not to reduce language to survival alone. Human speech would eventually carry tenderness, play, grief, ritual, memory, and imagination. But before it could do all that, it had to become useful enough to be kept. It had to help people live. In the slow life of early human groups, useful sounds would be repeated. Repeated sounds would become familiar. Familiar sounds would become easier to learn. Learned sounds could be passed to children. Children could carry them forward, perhaps changing them slightly, perhaps making them clearer, perhaps joining them with new gestures or new uses. No one would need to know that language was forming. They would only know that certain sounds helped the group move through the world. A call could hold people together across distance. A sound could make a hidden danger present. A signal could turn memory into action. And somewhere inside this long, quiet shaping speech may have begun to emerge, not as a single invention, but as the voice of survival becoming more precise, more shared, and more deeply human. Before writing, memory had to live in people. It had to be carried by bodies that could grow tired, by elders whose voices could weaken, by children who had to listen before they could fully understand, by groups that moved through land without maps and seasons without calendars. This is why the question of when humans first began to speak cannot be separated from the question of how humans remembered. A sound that warns in the present is useful, but a sound that helps memory return is something even more powerful. It allows a group to keep what would otherwise disappear, a place where water once remained after heat, a plant that made someone sick, a narrow crossing that became dangerous after rain, a trail where animals passed at a certain time of year, a cave that held shelter in wind, a death that changed how the group moved, a child born during a hard season. All of these things could matter long after the moment itself had passed. Without writing, they could not be stored outside the mind. They had to be repeated, shown, walked, sung, called, gestured, and remembered together. We should be careful not to imagine early speech as polished storytelling too soon. The first long stories, if we could hear them, may not have sounded like stories to us. They may have been fragments of memory joined to movement, repeated sounds tied to places, gestures that pointed toward events, rhythms that helped children remember what adults already knew. But even before formal story, the voice could help memory travel. One person's experience could become part of another person's caution. A sound made near a dangerous plant could return the next time a child reached toward it. A familiar vocal pattern connected to a route could help the group move back toward water. A repeated call used when someone returned could remind others of safety, presence, belonging. These small patterns may seem too ordinary to matter, but speech may have grown from ordinary things that became stable over time. A group that could preserve useful memory had a different relationship with the world. It did not have to begin again every morning as if the land were new. It could carry yesterday into today. It could let an old injury teach a young hand. It could let one person's mistake protect another person later. This is where language begins to feel less like a tool for naming objects and more like a tool for holding time. A cry belongs to one moment. A remembered sound can return after the moment is gone. A word, when words finally appear, can make an absent place present again. That ability would eventually become central to human life, to speak of what is not here, to recall what has passed, to prepare for what has not yet happened. But its earliest roots may have been quiet and practical. A group gathered near fire, an elder touching a scar, a hand pointing toward a ridge, a sound repeated slowly enough for a child to notice. No writing, no permanent record, no carved sentence, only the living movement of memory from one mind into another. In that movement, speech may have gained one of its deepest purposes. It did not only help people react, it helped them remember together. A memory becomes stronger when it is repeated in the presence of others. One person can remember a place, but a group can keep returning to that place only when the memory becomes shared. This may have been one of the quiet reasons speech mattered so deeply before writing. The land was not simply a background around early humans. It was a living pattern of remembered signs, where water gathered after rain, where stone could be shaped into tools, where animals crossed in certain seasons, where insects rose before weather changed, where certain plants appeared only for a short time, where a shelter could be found when cold wind came down from higher ground. To live well in such a world, a group needed more than eyes. It needed inherited attention. Young people had to learn what older people had already noticed. Children had to absorb warnings before they had the experience to understand the danger themselves. A person who had never been bitten, poisoned, lost, or trapped by weather could still be protected by someone else's memory. This is where the voice becomes more than sound. It becomes a way for experience to outlive the body that first carried it. We should not imagine this too neatly. Early humans did not have written lessons, formal classrooms, or carefully organized histories. Their knowledge likely moved through action, imitation, gesture, rhythm, tone, and repeated situations. A child might learn by walking the same path again and again, hearing the same sound, near the same bend in the river, seeing the same hand lifted toward the same kind of plant, feeling the same pause before crossing open ground. The voice would not stand alone. It would be joined to movement and place. But that is exactly why it could become powerful. A sound heard in a place could attach itself to that place. A repeated tone used near danger could return later as warning. A rhythm used while preparing food could help a child remember the steps. A soft correction could mark the difference between safe and unsafe, done and not yet done, this and not that. In these small ways, speech may have begun to help memory become teachable. This matters directly to the question of when humans first began to speak, because speaking is not only naming what is present, speaking is also carrying what someone else has not lived through. If an elder remembered a flood, the flood did not need to return before the young could learn caution. If a parent remembered a poisonous berry, the child did not need to become sick before the lesson mattered. If a group remembered where animals moved after snow or heat or long rain, that knowledge could guide feet before hunger became desperate. The first path towards speech may have passed through these moments, when remembered life became shared life. There is a tenderness in that idea, but also a cold truth. Groups that could not pass on knowledge would lose it. A person's death could take with it the memory of water, danger, healing, weather, or routes across the land. Before writing, the voice helped resist that loss. It could not preserve everything. It could fade, change, break, or be forgotten. But it gave memory a second body. It allowed knowledge to move from the old to the young, from the injured to the healthy, from the one who saw to the one who had not seen. Long before speech became formal story, it may have served as a fragile bridge across generations. A voice in the dusk, repeating what mattered, was not only filling silence, it was helping the group carry time. A story does not have to begin as entertainment. Long before stories became something told for wonder, they may have begun as memory with a shape. A path through dangerous ground becomes easier to remember when it is joined to a repeated sound. A warning about an animal becomes stronger when it is connected to the place where the animal was last seen. A lesson about food becomes easier for a child to hold when it comes with gesture, tone, rhythm, and the emotion of the person teaching it. In this way, the first stories before writing may not have been stories in the polished sense. They may have been pieces of remembered life, spoken again because they mattered. Someone had crossed a river when the water was too high. Someone had eaten the wrong plant. Someone had followed tracks into unsafe ground. Someone had found shelter where others did not expect it. Someone had not returned. Each of these memories could remain private and die with the person who carried it, or it could be given a form others could receive. Speech, even in an early and unfinished state, would have made that transfer more possible. It could hold together time, place, action, and feeling. It could make the young listen before they fully understood. It could let the old repeat what the body could no longer demonstrate. This is why the origin of speech may be close to the origin of teaching. Not teaching as a formal lesson, but teaching as the slow passing of attention from one generation to another. A hand could show how to shape a stone edge, but a voice could mark the moment when the angle was wrong. A gesture could show where to walk, but a sound could call someone back before a mistake was made. A scar could show that something had happened, but a voice could help others understand why the scar mattered. No writing was needed for such knowledge to become shared, but some stable form of communication was needed. The group had to keep certain memories alive long enough for children to grow into them. Perhaps this is where the voice began to carry not only command or warning, but sequence. First this, then that. Not there, but here. Not now, but later. Again, we should not force modern grammar into the deep past too early, but even simple sequences would have changed what communication could do. A sound tied to one action is useful. A series of sounds or signals tied to a series of actions is more powerful. It allows knowledge to unfold. It lets a listener follow a path that is not being walked at that exact moment. It lets the mind rehearse. Slowly, the voice could become a place where experience was arranged. This does not tell us the date when humans first began to speak, but it shows why speech would have been kept once it started to grow. It allowed the group to remember more than any single person could safely hold alone. It made memory less fragile. It gave shape to loss, danger, return, food, weather, care, and belonging. Before writing, there was no permanent page where human life could rest. There were only bodies, voices, gestures, places, and repeated acts of remembering. A spoken memory could change over time. It could fade or be reshaped. It was not perfect, but it was alive. And perhaps that was enough. Long before humans wrote down history, they may have been carrying the first forms of history in the breath between them, not as exact records, but as living guidance. The first stories may have begun when a sound no longer pointed only to what was here, but also to what had happened, what should be remembered, and what might happen again. Memory, before writing, was never perfectly still. It changed each time it was carried by a living voice. A person could remember a path clearly in youth, then later remember it through age, injury, loss, or longing. A story about a dangerous crossing could become shorter when told to a child, longer when told beside a fire, sharper when the group was near that place again. This does not make spoken memory useless. It makes it human. Before writing, knowledge had to survive through repetition, attention, trust, and correction. If someone remembered wrongly, another person might gesture, interrupt, repeat the sound differently, or guide the group back toward what had actually happened. In this way, memory was not only stored in one mind, it was held between people. The voice allowed memory to move, but the group helped keep memory from drifting too far. This matters for the origin of speech, because language may have grown stronger wherever memory needed to be shared, checked, and kept alive. A single warning can save someone once. A remembered warning can protect many people over time. A single experience can teach one person. A spoken experience can become useful to those who were not there. In a world without writing, this was one of speech's deepest values. It allowed life to become less isolated. One person's wound could become a lesson. One person's discovery could become a root. One person's grief could become a memory the group carried together. We should not imagine this as exact history in the modern sense. Early spoken memory was probably not a perfect record. It may have blended practical facts with emotion, rhythm, gesture, place, and repeated social meaning. But even imperfect memory can guide survival. A group did not need a written map to remember that water could be found beyond a ridge. It did not need a written warning to keep children away from a plant that had caused sickness. It did not need a carved sentence to remember that a storm had once made a low path dangerous. The living voice could do some of that work. It could bring the absent event back into the present long enough for the group to act differently. This is the quiet power that connects speech with time. Sound exists only for a moment, but meaning can return through memory. A voice heard today can carry a lesson from a season that is gone. A child can learn about a danger before meeting it. A young adult can follow a route first walked by someone older. Rooting, a group can move with the experience of people who are no longer strong enough to lead the way. And after death, even a person's knowledge may continue for a while in the voices of those who learned from them. This is not a dramatic claim. It is a simple truth about oral life. Before writing, the human voice was one of the main ways knowledge resisted disappearance. It could not stop forgetting completely. It could not preserve every detail, but it could slow the loss. It could give memory more than one body. A remembered sound, repeated at the right time, could become almost like a tool, not a tool made of stone or bone, but a tool made of breath and attention. It helped shape behavior. It helped organize the group's relation to the land. It helped connect older experience with younger uncertainty. When we ask when humans first began to speak, we are also asking when the voice began to hold this kind of inherited usefulness. Not only danger now, but danger remembered. Not only food here, but food found before and expected again. Not only a person present, but a person missed, named in some way, recalled by sound, gesture, silence, or place. These are the beginnings of a world where speech does more than direct movement. It keeps human life from being trapped entirely in the present. The more a group could speak, even in early and limited ways, the more it could live with a past that still mattered. That past might be practical, emotional, or social. It might involve a route, a tool-making method, a death, a season, a mistake, a promise, a place of safety, or a place to avoid. Each time such memory was voiced again, it entered the ears of someone who had not lived it, and in that transfer, speech became more than sound. It became a bridge across unequal experience. The old had seen what the young had not seen. The injured knew what the healthy might still risk. The one who had wandered knew where the group might go. The one who had lost someone knew that absence could still shape behavior. A spoken memory could not bring back the past, but it could let the past remain useful. Perhaps this is one reason human speech became so powerful once it began to grow. It did not merely describe the world. It allowed the world to be remembered together. It made the group larger than the present moment. It made each person's life partly available to others. And in the long silence before writing, that may have been one of the most important things a voice could do. A spoken sound becomes even more powerful when it can point to something no one can touch. This may be one of the most important thresholds on the long path toward human speech. At first, a sound might draw attention to danger, food, movement, a child, a path, or a place. These are things close to the body, close to survival, close to what the eyes can see, or what memory can easily return to. But human language eventually came to hold much more than the visible world. It could speak of someone who was absent. It could speak of a place beyond the horizon. It could speak of yesterday, tomorrow, the dead, the imagined, the hoped for, the feared, and the unseen connection between one event and another. We should not rush too quickly into this deeper world, because the evidence is difficult and the risks of exaggeration are high. A shell bead, a pigment mark, a burial, or an image on stone does not give us a recording of speech. It does not tell us exactly what early humans believed, said, named, or explained. But such traces can suggest that minds were beginning to live not only inside immediate needs, but inside symbols. A symbol is not the thing itself. It stands for something. A mark on a surface is not the animal, the person, the path, or the memory, yet it can hold attention as if something absent has been brought near. This is close to what speech does. A sound is not water, but it can call people toward water. A sound is not danger, but it can make danger present in the mind. A sound is not the person who is gone, but it can let others remember that person together. In this sense, speech and symbolic thought may have grown close to each other, each one strengthening the other over long periods of time. The voice could help explain a mark. A mark could help memory return when the voice was silent. A repeated gesture could connect a shape, a place, and a shared meaning. None of this means that we can translate the earliest symbols. We cannot look at an ancient mark and safely say exactly what words stood beside it. That would be pretending to know more than the evidence allows. But we can say that the ability to use signs, to treat one thing as carrying the meaning of another, belongs near the heart of human language. Before speech could become rich, the mind had to accept this strange movement, that something small could stand for something larger, something present could stand for something absent, and something made by the body could travel into the mind of another person. In a quiet prehistoric shelter, a line scratched into stone, a colour placed on skin, a shell worn on the body, or a repeated pattern on a surface may have carried meanings that are now lost to us. Perhaps they marked belonging. Perhaps they marked memory. Perhaps they helped people recognize one another, remember a place, or hold a shared feeling. We should leave those possibilities open without turning them into false certainty. What matters for the origin of speech is not to decode every sign, but to see that human communication was widening. It was moving beyond immediate signals into a world where meaning could be carried by sound, gesture, object, color, mark, rhythm, and memory. Somewhere in that widening world, speech could become more than a tool for survival. It could become a way of giving shape to what could not be held in the hand. A mark on stone is still silent unless someone knows how to look at it. This is why symbols and speech may have depended on the same human habit. Shared meaning. A line, a color, a shell, a carved shape, or a handprint does not speak by itself. It becomes meaningful only inside a group that remembers, repeats, and recognizes what it may stand for. In the same way, a sound is only air until someone has learned how to hear it as a sign. This connection is important for the question of when humans first began to speak, because the rise of symbolic behavior suggests a mind that was becoming comfortable with one thing representing another. A sound could stand for danger, a gesture could stand for direction, a mark could stand for presence, belonging, memory, or something we can no longer recover. We should remain careful, because ancient symbols are among the easiest things to overinterpret. We cannot look at a painted shape, a pierced shell, or a burial object and honestly claim to know the exact sentence that once surrounded it. We cannot say with certainty what early humans believed about death, animals, spirits, ancestors, or the unseen world, but we can say that symbolic traces show a widening of human attention. They suggest that people were not only reacting to immediate needs, but also making, keeping, and returning to signs. That habit belongs close to language. Speech is also a sign-making act. When someone speaks, they use a sound that is not the thing itself, but that can bring the thing into another person's mind. This is simple when we think of a visible object, but far more complex when speech begins to hold what cannot be touched. A dead person is not present beside the fire, yet a voice can make the group remember them. A place beyond the ridge is not visible, yet a voice can guide others toward it. A fear about tomorrow has not happened, yet a voice can make the group prepare. A rule about sharing food is not a stone or a tree, yet it can shape behavior if people carry it together. Symbols and speech both allow human life to stretch beyond the immediate surface of the world. They make absence socially present. Perhaps this is why symbolic behavior matters so much in the long search for the origin of speech. It does not give us the first word, but it tells us something about the kind of mind in which words could grow. A mind able to treat a shell as more than a shell, a colour as more than colour, a mark as more than a mark, may also be a mind able to treat a sound as more than a sound. Around shelters, near caves, on open ground, or during movement across familiar land, these forms of meaning could have worked together. A person might gesture toward a mark. Another might make a sound associated with it. A child might hear the sound many times in the same place and slowly learn that the mark mattered. The voice could teach the sign, and the sign could help the voice return. This does not require us to imagine written language. Writing is much later. These were not letters in the modern sense. They were signs within lived experience, and their meanings, if they had meanings, belong to communities whose voices are gone. But even without knowing the meanings, we can see the broader pattern. Early human communication was becoming layered. Sound, gesture, memory, place, object, and shared attention could join together. The question of speech, then, becomes part of a larger question about how human beings learn to live inside shared meanings. Not only seeing the same thing, but understanding that the same thing could point beyond itself. Not only hearing the same sound, but remembering that the sound had carried meaning before. Somewhere inside this growing symbolic world, speech may have found a deeper home. It could begin to carry not only what was useful, but what mattered. The unseen world does not have to mean something supernatural. For early humans, much of life was unseen in a very practical sense. The animal behind the trees was unseen. The water beyond the ridge was unseen. The coming storm was unseen until the sky changed enough to warn the body. A person who had died was unseen, yet still remembered. A child not yet born was unseen, yet the group's future depended on children arriving, surviving, and learning. The next season was unseen. The safe path through unfamiliar land was unseen. The meaning of a mark, a gesture, or a sound was also unseen because meaning cannot be held in the hand. It has to be shared. This is where symbolic thought and speech come close together. Both allow human beings to deal with what is not directly present. Both help the mind reach beyond the surface of the moment. A sound can bring back a place. A mark can hold attention after the person who made it has walked away. A repeated gesture can carry a rule, a memory, or a warning without becoming a physical object itself. We should not say too much about what early humans believed when they buried their dead, used pigment, wore ornaments, or made marks on stone. The evidence can show us that something was done, sometimes with care, repetition, and selection, but it cannot always tell us what was said or thought. A burial does not translate itself. A painted sign does not speak in a language we can recover. A bead does not tell us whether it meant beauty, belonging, memory, exchange, identity, or something else entirely, but these traces still matter, because they show that human life was becoming more layered. People were not only eating, moving, sleeping, and avoiding danger. They were also treating certain things as meaningful beyond their immediate use. A colour could be placed where colour was not needed for survival. An object could be carried because it mattered to the group. A mark could remain in a place and invite return. Such acts do not prove full-spoken language by themselves, but they fit naturally with a mind increasingly able to use signs. The voice, in that world, could have helped bind signs to shared understanding. A child might see adults return to the same marked place. A sound might be used there again and again. A gesture might show that the place should be approached differently. A remembered person might be spoken of, not in the exact words we know, but through some pattern of voice, silence, touch, and attention. In this way, speech may have grown not only from the need to survive, but from the need to hold meaning together when the object of meaning was absent. This is one of the deepest differences between a simple signal and a richer human language. A signal can say, "Danger now." A richer form of speech can say, "Danger was here. Danger may return. Remember what happened. Teach the child before the child meets it." A signal can bring the group together in the moment. Speech can begin to carry the reasons why the group gathers, what it remembers, what it fears, what it hopes to preserve. Still, the beginning remains hidden. We cannot point to the first symbol and hear the first word beside it. We cannot know whether a painted mark was named, explained, sung around, or left in silence. What we can say, carefully, is that the path towards speech was probably not separate from the path towards shared meaning. As sounds became more stable, signs may have become more meaningful. As signs became more meaningful, voices may have had more to carry. Together, they helped create a human world in which the visible and invisible could meet. A mark on stone, a memory in the mind, a voice in the air, and another person listening. If we ask when humans first began to speak, we eventually have to ask who we mean by humans. The answer is not as simple as it first appears. Today, only Homo sapiens remain, so it is easy to imagine speech as something that belongs only to us, arriving fully inside our own species and separating us sharply from every other form of life. But the deep past was not so empty. For much of human evolution, our ancestors and close relatives were not alone. Other kinds of humans, including Neanderthals and Denisovans, lived, moved, made tools, cared for one another, and left traces of bodies and behavior that are still being studied. Their voices are gone, just as the earliest voices of Homo sapiens are gone. We cannot hear them. We cannot recover their conversations. We cannot know whether a Neanderthal child was called by something like a name, whether a Denisovan group used repeated vocal patterns while moving through a landscape, or whether different human groups understood one another when they met. But we should be careful not to mistake our ignorance for silence. The absence of recorded speech does not mean the absence of communication. The older image of ancient human relatives as mute, simple, or sharply below us has become harder to defend as evidence has grown more complex. Neanderthals had large brains, made tools, used fire, lived in social groups, survived in difficult climates, and show signs of care for injured or vulnerable individuals. Some evidence also suggests that they may have used pigments, ornaments, or symbolic behaviors in certain contexts, though the interpretation of such evidence is debated and must be handled carefully. None of this proves that Neanderthals spoke like modern humans. It does not give us grammar, stories, or the sound of their voices. But it does suggest that the roots of speech may reach deeper than a simple story, in which only modern Homo sapiens suddenly crossed into language while all other human relatives remained outside. The question becomes more subtle. Perhaps different human groups had different levels of vocal and gestural communication. Perhaps some had rich signals, some had more flexible calls, some had forms of social communication that would feel language-like in certain ways and unfamiliar in others. Perhaps the path towards speech was not a single line, but a widening field shared in part by related human forms. This possibility matters because it keeps the story honest. It prevents us from turning speech into a sudden badge of superiority. It reminds us that language may have grown from older capacities already present before Homo sapiens became the only humans left. If Neanderthals could hear subtle sound differences, control aspects of voice, learn from one another, and live in groups where cooperation mattered, then the question is not whether they were silent animals or modern speakers. The better question is how far along the long road of meaningful communication they may have travelled. We may never know the full answer. But by asking it carefully, we begin to see speech not as a single light switched on in one species, but as a deep human possibility, shaped over time by bodies, minds, relationships, and shared life. The first speaking beings may not have stood alone at the end of evolution. They may have belonged to a much older, more tangled family of voices, most of which have vanished without leaving their sound behind. Neanderthals are important to this question because they stand close enough to us to make the boundary of speech feel uncertain. They were not our ancestors in a simple straight line, but they were close human relatives, and for a time they shared parts of the world with Homo sapiens. Their bodies, tools, shelters, and survival in difficult environments show that they were not simple figures in the background of human history. They lived through cold landscapes, hunted large animals, used fire, made stone tools with skill, and seemed to have cared for members of their groups who could not have survived easily alone. These facts do not prove language, but they do make silence harder to assume. A group that hunts, cares, teaches, remembers roots, handles danger, and raises children over long periods has many reasons to communicate. The question is how rich that communication was. Did Neanderthals use controlled vocal sounds? Did they combine sound with gesture? Did they have names for places, people, or repeated dangers? Did they tell children where not to go, when to wait, how to shape a tool, or what signs in the land mattered? We do not know. The evidence does not allow us to hear their answers. But the question itself matters because it prevents us from making human speech seem like an isolated miracle that appeared only after everything else was already in place. Some clues invite caution and curiosity at the same time. Neanderthal anatomy suggests they were not built like apes, simply making rough calls. Parts of their hearing and vocal anatomy have been discussed as potentially compatible with more complex communication, though compatibility is not the same as proof. Genetic evidence has also shown that Neanderthals shared with modern humans a version of FOXP2, a gene involved in speech and language development. But this must be handled carefully. FOXP2 is not a language gene in the simple sense. It does not create grammar by itself. It is only one part of a much larger biological system involving brain development, motor control, learning, hearing, and social use. To say Neanderthals had a similar form of this gene is not to say they spoke exactly as we do. It only means the old picture of them as voiceless and far removed from speech is too crude. Their possible communication may have been rich in some ways and limited in others. It may have included gestures, calls, learned sounds, emotional tones, and perhaps more stable vocal patterns. It may have allowed cooperation, teaching, warning, and care without matching the full flexibility of modern human language. Or it may have been closer to speech than we once imagined. We have to leave room for uncertainty because the evidence is indirect. A stone tool can show planning, but not the words used while teaching its shape. A burial can suggest care or social meaning, but not the sentence spoken nearby. A healed injury can show that a person was supported, but not whether support came with names, calls, or quiet repeated sounds. Still, these traces show lives that were social enough to make communication necessary. When we ask whether speech belonged only to Homo sapiens, we are really asking how deep the roots of meaningful communication go. Perhaps speech did not belong to a single species in a sharp, finished form at first. Perhaps it belonged to a family of related abilities, unevenly shared among ancient humans, growing stronger in some groups, fading with others, changing as bodies, minds, and societies changed. Neanderthals remind us that the first human voices may not have come from one lonely branch. They may have risen from a wider human world where several kinds of people listened, called, gestured, taught, and remembered in ways that are now almost completely gone. Denisovans make the question even quieter, because we know far less about them than we know about Neanderthals. For a long time, they were not known through complete skeletons or familiar images, but through small fragments of bone, teeth, and genetic evidence. They remind us that much of the human past is still made of shadows. There were people, or close human relatives, moving through landscapes we can barely reconstruct, carrying bodies, memories, skills, and social lives that left only a few traces behind. Their voices, if they had voices shaped into meaningful patterns, are even farther from us than Neanderthal voices. We do not know what they sounded like. We do not know how they called to children, how they warned one another, how they taught, how they remembered places, or whether their communication would feel familiar to us in any way. But their existence matters because it widens the frame. The story of speech was not unfolding in a world with only one kind of human standing alone. It was unfolding in a tangled human family, with groups separating, meeting, mixing, disappearing, and leaving small pieces of themselves in later populations. In such a world, the roots of speech may have been spread across deep time before the world became ours alone. We should not say that Denisovans spoke as modern humans do. The evidence is too limited for that. We should not build a full language out of a tooth, a bone fragment, or a genetic trace. That would be dishonest. But we can say that the question of speech cannot be answered by looking only at the final surviving branch. If several human relatives had complex bodies, social lives, tools, movement patterns, and long childhoods, then communication was likely important across more than one branch of the human family. The difficult question is not whether they communicated, but how far their communication had moved towards speech. Perhaps some groups had rich gesture and voice systems that never became as flexible as modern language. Perhaps some had vocal learning traditions that were stable inside small communities. Perhaps some could share practical knowledge with sounds, gestures, and imitation, but not speak about absent things as freely as we do. Perhaps some were closer to us than we expect. We do not know, and because we do not know, the honest story must leave space around them. That space is not empty. It is filled with caution. It is filled with the knowledge that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Speech leaves almost nothing behind, and entire populations can vanish while keeping their voices hidden forever. This makes the origin of speech feel less like a single human achievement, and more like a long question moving through many kinds of human life. By the time Homo sapiens became the only humans left, speech may already have had a deep history behind it. It may have passed through older ancestors, related groups, shared capacities, and many experiments in sound and meaning that did not survive as separate living traditions. Some of those voices may have gone silent without ever becoming part of our direct memory. Others may have left faint traces through contact and ancestry, not in words we can recover, but in the biological and cultural entanglement of ancient humans. The safest conclusion is also the most humbling one. Speech was probably not born in a clean, lonely moment. It likely emerged from a wider world of bodies that could vocalize, minds that could remember, groups that had to cooperate, and human relatives whose lives were richer than the silence of the record suggests. When we ask when humans first began to speak, we may be asking a question that belongs not to one species alone, but to a whole vanished landscape of human voices, most of them lost before anyone could write down that they had ever existed. By the time we reach the final part of this question, The first word has begun to feel less like a lost object and more like a horizon. The closer we walk toward it, the farther it seems to move. We can follow bones, tools, shelters, fire, memory, symbols, children, cooperation, and the lives of other ancient humans. But no path leads us to a single moment where speech clearly begins. That may be because there was no such moment. Human speech may not have arrived as one clean event, one voice, one word, one discovery that changed everything at once. It may have arrived the way dawn arrives, so slowly that no one standing inside it can say exactly when night ended. A sound became familiar. A gesture became expected. A call became more controlled. A child learned what others had repeated. A group remembered which signals mattered. A voice began to carry not only fear, but direction. Not only hunger, but return. Not only presence, but absence. Not only the visible world, but the remembered one. Across many generations, these small changes could have gathered until speech was no longer separate from human life. The people living through this change would not have called it language beginning. They would have been living, caring, moving, teaching, waiting, warning, and remembering. The most important changes in human life are not always visible to the people who carry them. A child born into a group where certain sounds already mattered would simply learn those sounds as part of the world. Another child, many generations later, might inherit slightly clearer sounds, more stable patterns, more shared meanings. No one would need to stand at the center of history and invent speech. The group itself, over time, could become the place where speech grew. This makes the question, when did humans first begin to speak, both difficult and beautiful. It asks for a date, but the evidence offers a process. It asks for a first word, but the past gives us conditions. Bodies able to shape breath, minds able to remember, groups that needed one another, children who learned from adults, elders who carried knowledge, landscapes that demanded shared attention, and symbols that let meaning reach beyond the present moment. The honest answer must remain open. We can say that the roots of speech are ancient. We can say that they likely reach far back before writing, before cities, before farming, before the earliest records of human voices. We can say that speech probably grew from older forms of communication, rather than appearing suddenly from silence. But we cannot say exactly when the first true word was spoken, because speech left no first footprint. It left only the world that became possible after voices began to carry meaning. A group could prepare for danger not yet seen. A child could learn from a mistake they had not made. A place could be remembered before it was reached. A person who was absent could still be held in the minds of others. This is the quiet power speech brought into human life. It allowed experience to travel. It allowed time to gather inside sound. It allowed one mind to become, for a moment, less alone. If there was no single first word, then the beginning of speech may belong to a different kind of history. It may belong to the history of thresholds that no one noticed while crossing them. A group begins by reacting to sound. Later, it recognizes sound. Later still, it remembers sound. Then sound begins to return in similar moments, shaped by the body, expected by others, carried by children, adjusted by use. No one step is enough to be called language by itself, yet each step makes the next one easier. This is often how deep human changes happen. They do not always announce themselves. They gather quietly inside daily life. A child learns a sound because adults use it. An adult repeats a signal because children respond to it. A group keeps a vocal pattern because it helps them move, teach, soothe, warn, or remember. Over time, the sound becomes part of the group's world. It is no longer just a noise that happened once. It is something expected, something shared, something that can return. This may be one of the safest ways to think about the origin of speech, not as a sudden invention, but as the slow stabilization of meaning in the voice. Such a view also protects us from pretending to know too much. It lets us hold the evidence honestly. Fossils can tell us about bodies, but not sentences. Tools can show planning, but not the sounds used during teaching. Fire can show a changed way of life, but not the conversations that may have gathered around it. Symbols can suggest minds capable of representation, but not the exact words that stood beside them. The remains of Neanderthals and Denisovans can widen the question, but they cannot give back the voices of vanished human relatives. Each clue matters, but each clue has limits. The educational value of this question is not only in searching for an answer, it is also in learning how to think carefully about what the past can and cannot tell us. The origin of speech asks us to respect uncertainty. It asks us not to fill silence with fantasy just because a complete story would feel more satisfying. At the same time, uncertainty does not mean emptiness. The past is not blank simply because it is quiet. Behind that quiet are bodies that breathed, hands that gestured, ears that listened, children who learned, elders who remembered, groups that depended on one another, and voices that may have carried meaning long before anyone could preserve them. This is the gentle balance we need. Imagination guided by evidence, and evidence held with humility. We can imagine early humans calling through darkness, but we should not invent the exact word. We can imagine a child learning from a repeated sound, but we should not claim to know the language of that child. We can imagine a group remembering a dead companion, but we should not pretend to know the belief behind the silence. What we can say is quieter and stronger. Speech likely grew because human life needed shared meaning. It helped turn private experience into collective knowledge. It helped one person's memory become another person's caution. It helped a group stay together when distance, darkness, hunger, danger, and time pulled them apart. If language is part of what makes us human, then its beginning may not be found in a single spoken word, but in the long effort of human beings to become understandable to one another. Long before writing made memory visible, the voice made memory movable. Long before history was recorded, speech allowed experience to cross from one life into another. And perhaps that is why the first word remains hidden. It was not important because it was first. It was important because someone heard it, remembered it, and answered. There is a quiet responsibility in telling a story like this. The farther we move back into the human past, the more tempting it becomes to fill the darkness with certainty. A clean answer would be comforting. It would be easy to say that speech began with one species, in one place, at one time, with one first word spoken near fire or danger or food. It would make the story simpler. It would make the mystery easier to package. But deep history rarely gives us that kind of permission. The beginning of speech sits in a space where evidence is real but incomplete. Fossils can suggest anatomy. Archaeology can suggest behavior. Genetics can suggest relationships and biological capacities. Studies of living humans and other animals can help us think about communication, learning, gesture, and sound. Yet none of these can return the first voice to us. None can let us hear the first child being called back from danger, the first remembered place described in sound, or the first time a group understood something that was not visible because one person shaped breath in a meaningful way. The honest lesson is not that we know nothing. It is that we know carefully. We know that speech needs a body capable of controlled sound. We know it needs hearing, memory, learning, social life, and shared attention. We know that humans and their close relatives lived in groups where communication mattered. We know that before writing, knowledge had to pass through living beings. We know that symbols, tools, care, fire, childhood, and movement through land all created conditions where shared meaning could become more important. But between these conditions and the first true word, there is still a gap. That gap should not be treated as a weakness in the story. It is part of the truth. It reminds us that the human past was not made for us to fully recover. It was lived by people who did not know they would become evidence. They did not leave their voices for us. They left what survived by chance: stone, bone, pigment, traces of fire, fragments of bodies, patterns in DNA, and marks in places where time was gentle enough to preserve them. The rest was carried in breath. And breath is loyal only to the moment. This is why a sleep audio story about speech should not become a loud claim. It should become a slow act of listening. We listen to what science can say, and we listen just as carefully to what it cannot say. We allow uncertainty to remain calm, instead of turning it into fear or drama. We allow the absence of direct evidence to make the story more thoughtful, not less meaningful. Because the question of speech is not only a question about prehistoric mouths, it is a question about how humans became able to share inner life. How did fear become warning? How did memory become teaching? How did a place become something that could be carried in sound? How did a person who was absent remain present in the minds of others? How did a child learn from dangers they had not yet met? How did one mind begin to travel, gently and imperfectly, into another? These are not small questions. They are among the deepest questions we can ask about being human. And still, the answer may have been made of ordinary things. Repeated calls, familiar voices, children listening, elders remembering, hands pointing, bodies gathering, breath shaped again and again in the presence of others. This should make us cautious, but it should also make us respectful. Every word spoken today stands at the far end of that long, hidden process. Every gentle instruction, every remembered story, every warning, every apology, every lullaby, every name called across a room, depends on abilities that were not built in a single moment. They were shaped through time by need, care, attention, and the fragile wish to be understood. To know this is useful because it changes the way we hear ordinary speech. A voice is not only sound, it is inherited coordination. It is biology, memory, culture, childhood, trust, and breath, working together. A sentence is not only information, it is a bridge built from countless older bridges. And when we speak carefully, truthfully, and kindly, we are using one of the oldest human tools in the way it may have mattered most, to help another mind come closer without force. That may be the educational value at the heart of this entire journey. The origin of speech teaches us not to treat language as something cheap or automatic. It teaches us that words can protect, mislead, comfort, divide, remember, and guide. It teaches us that truth matters precisely because speech is powerful. If a voice can carry knowledge across generations, it can also carry errors. If a voice can calm fear, it can also create fear. If a voice can make the absent present, it can also make imagined certainty feel real. So the search for the first speech is also a reminder about responsibility now. We do not know the first word, but we know that words became important because others trusted them. That trust is still part of language. It is still what makes speech worth hearing. And as we come back toward the final question, we may not need to solve the mystery completely. We may only need to hold it with enough honesty to understand what it says about us. That human beings became human not only by making sounds, but by learning, slowly, that another mind was waiting on the other side of the sound. So perhaps the most honest ending is not an answer, but a change in the way we hear the question, when did humans first begin to speak? Not on a date we can circle, not in a cave we can name with certainty, not with a single word preserved like a tool in the ground. The beginning of speech may have been spread across countless lives, in many places, through many small acts that no one thought were historic. A child heard a familiar sound and came closer. An adult repeated a warning that others understood. A group remembered where water had been found. Someone pointed toward a ridge and gave a sound that made others look. Someone used the voice to calm fear, to call through darkness, to teach a hand how to shape stone, to keep the memory of danger alive after the danger was gone. None of these moments alone would be enough to explain language, but together, over deep time, they show the kind of world in which speech could slowly become human. It was a world where bodies could shape breath, where minds could hold memory, where groups needed trust, where children learned by listening, where elders carried knowledge, where signs and sounds began to point beyond themselves. The first speakers, if we can even call them that, may not have known they were speaking in a new way. They may have felt only the ordinary pressure of life, to be understood before it was too late, to help the young before they were harmed, to bring others toward food, to guide them away from danger, to remember the dead, to prepare for seasons, to keep a fragile group together beneath a sky that gave no written instructions. This is the educational lesson hidden inside the mystery. Human speech should not be treated as a magic line that suddenly made us superior to everything before us. It was more likely a long inheritance, built from older forms of communication, shaped by anatomy, memory, cooperation, care, and time. To speak truthfully about it, we have to respect what science can show and what it cannot show. We can study fossils, tools, genes, hearing, the brain, symbolic behavior, and the lives of ancient human relatives. We can compare possibilities. We can follow clues, but we should not turn uncertainty into false certainty. The silence in the record is not permission to invent anything we like. It is an invitation to be careful. And yet, carefulness does not make the story smaller. It makes it more moving. Because if speech grew slowly, then every ordinary human voice today carries a history older than writing, older than cities, older than the names of nations, older than the first recorded stories. Every quiet word of comfort, every warning, every lesson passed from parent to child, every memory spoken aloud, belongs to that long chain of breath and meaning. We speak now as if speech has always been here, but it may have taken hundreds of thousands of years for sound to become this gentle bridge between minds. And maybe that is why the first word is lost. It was not carved into stone. It was carried by someone living, heard by someone nearby, and then carried forward again. The question remains open, resting where evidence ends and humility begins. If speech began so slowly that no one noticed its arrival, how many of the deepest changes in being human have happened the same way?